presentation into three parts. First, I'll share some insights from my book and reflect on my 20-year career at the World Bank, 10 years as the Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and more recently, on the work of the African Center for Economic Transformation, the think tank that I established 12 years ago here in Accra. Through it all, I have seen consistent factors in the success or failure of development policies, plans, and initiatives in Africa. Second, I will stress the critical importance of leadership and governance, especially in the context of democracy here in Ghana. Looking back at Ghana's fourth republic, we see a mixed record. But recent initiatives such as the Ghana COVID-19 Alleviation and Revitalization of Enterprises Support Program, or CARES Ghana program, offer a promising path forward. And third, I'll go a little down the path and share a proposal for a national consensus around certain key pillars of our governance, political processes, economic management, and policies of inclusion. A few years ago, President Akufo-Addo offered a vision of, quote, an optimistic, self-confident, and prosperous nation through the creative exploitation of our human and natural resources. I hope the proposals I'll outline can help ensure we get there. Let me briefly talk a bit about my career. I joined the World Bank through the Young Professionals Program in 1974. During the early part of my career, I worked as an economist and later as division chief in charge of the bank's programs in a number of countries in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. This involved collaborating with the IMF and particularly on the informal structural adjustment lending operations. Starting in the mid-1980s, in response to both internal and external pressures and controversies over structural adjustment, the bank started putting more emphasis on social development, encompassing education, health, labor markets, early childhood development, and gender or women in development, as it was called then. In 1991, I suddenly found myself in the Latin America and Caribbean region of the bank, with the task of boosting the bank's policy engagements and lending programs in Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela. In 2 years, together with the outstanding staff of sector specialists, we were able to turn things around. We laid the foundation that resulted in the division leading a massive increase in the bank's portfolio of projects in the social sectors. With that record behind me, I was promoted to become the first director of the Education and Social Policy Department. Our main mission was to provide the analytical and policy research to guide the bank's work in poverty reduction strategies. After 20 years at the World Bank, I was appointed by Boutros Ghali, then the UN Secretary General, to head the UN Economic Commission for Africa. In 2005, I left the ECA and after 10 years returned home to Ghana. I remained committed to Africa and I was proud of the work I had done. But I also realized that despite all the efforts and progress Africa had made, there was still a lot to do, in particular, ensure the economic transformation of African countries. And that's why I consulted widely and formed the African Center for Economic Transformation, whose model is to do research, work with African partners and development partners in general on the transformation agenda for Africa. Now let me turn to my book. Could you go back to the other slide, please? Yeah. Know the beginning well, an inside journey through 5 decades of African development and why I wrote it. As I state in the book's preface, my goal was to give people involved in African development, policymakers, practitioners, students, researchers, anyone, another tool to learn from the past to better inform the future. And so the title, Know the Beginning Well, comes from an African proverb. If you know the beginning well, the end shall not trouble you. So the book is in part memoir, but mostly it is about the inside journey of the title. I was 30 years old at Ghana's independence. I have seen much of Africa's journey, all the ups and downs. I have been fortunate to work on many of the issues and involved with the policies, key players, and leaders that have shaped the course of Africa's development through the career I have just described. Certain themes run through the book that are the most important factors for applying past lessons to current and future actions. And it is interesting because on the surface, they all seem so straightforward. People, policies, institutions. In my experience, that is what it all comes down to. That smart policies matter, effective institutions matter, and capacity matters, country ownership matters, and strong and visionary leaders from the people who set and implement the agenda matters. And consistent within each of these areas is the critical need for capacity, as I've said. Capacity to create policy, to help build and run institutions, and to have the political will to lead. Allow me to illustrate how these factors influence the economic and political fortunes of 6 countries where I actively engaged with policymakers and the political leadership during my time at the World Bank. So you see on this slide, let's start with Sudan. You see the stars. I have policy, institutional capacity, and ethnicity. The key here is that in Sudan, when I started working on Sudan, issues of policy alignment became so critical. Sudan had a lot of resources in agriculture. Later they discovered oil, but to put the right policies in place to exploit these resources became a big challenge. And that's why debt became so huge. They borrowed so much, they didn't have institutional capacity. They couldn't even track how much debt they had. Ministers were going around to borrow. And leadership was not visionary. That's how I have not checked it at all. And that leadership issue became lack of visionary leadership. There was Mary, then came Bashir. So you know the whole history of Sudan and where Sudan is at today, and the ethnicity, the conflict between the South and the North. So these are the issues that have pervaded Sudan's history. And today, the country's crisis continues for many of these same factors. So that's the story about Sudan. Lack of capacity, poor leadership, ethnicity, and obviously I haven't checked good governance because governance was a major issue in Sudan and it has been up until today. So those were the lessons for Sudan. Let's move to Zambia. I spent five years, almost 5 years of my career living in Zambia, working as a World Bank representative. I think I went there in 1981 and stayed until 1985. It was an interesting time. Zambia had gotten independence in 1964, as you recall, with a lot of resources, copper. But the first decade or two, policies were just atrocious. And per capita incomes actually fell heavily. And by the time I got there, Zambia's promise was Gambia was in huge economic crisis. But the key issue to Zambia's success then, that I want to emphasize, was the leadership of Kaunda. I had a very close relationship with him. And I realized that with him, once he got the policies and the clear understanding, he would make the tough decisions. He brought in a few key ministers who worked with us and with some of the development policies to turn the whole issue around to the extent that for some time, Zambia's performance became quite spectacular. And there, the multi-party, Zambia was a one-party state, but that forced them to go into multi-party democracy with elections that led to Kaunda stepping down, and then Chiluba. So there's a whole history about Zambia, how leadership mattered at a critical time, and in that comes governance. On the part of Kaunda, there have been problems, and so that's the Zambia story. Kenya, at independence, had a lot going for it, and there was a lot of expectations. The infrastructure was good, the education system was good, but Kenya also ran into huge problems, and there were two main factors in Kenya. One of governance, corruption. And the well good governance actually came out of some developments in Kenya, where we realized that a lot of the resources from the donors and others were going into people's pockets. There was a huge project, and the corruption that was associated with scared the international community. It forced the World Bank and others to demand that Kenya puts governance issues on the agenda. Actually, that's where the phrase good governance came up. Governance was not then part of the development agenda, and the World Bank, for example, was not taking these issues into consideration, but then became the realization that all the resources from donors and even from the country itself was not making a difference. So the phrase good governance came out of discussions on the Good Kenya program. Uganda was very interesting. And again, the same issues came through. The big difference in Uganda was when Museveni first came to power, he had vision, he had commitment. In fact, I was so impressed that you discuss issues with with Museveni, and he got it. He brought his ministers together. They owned the program and implemented them. They were not easy. And then they used to say, we are doing this because we think it's good for us. It's not because you guys are telling us, but we need your help. And this is the way we want to do it. So that is how, after a number of years, Uganda became the top performer in Africa. It was because of the leadership and the commitment in the initial years that Kaunda Museveni showed. You all know about Uganda's story today, so I won't go there, but I'm talking about Uganda in the 80s and 90s, where these developments. So governance, a visionary leadership, policy alignment, oh yeah, he really understood, he got it, and he was committed to it, and institutional capacity. He brought some key ministers and says, let's go, let's work on this, it's for our own good. And that was the story about Uganda. Finally, Ethiopia, I started working in Ethiopia when I was in the bank, but the Ethiopia story became more prominent to me when I was living in Addis Ababa as head of the Economic Commission for Africa, where I worked very, very closely with Prime Minister Meles and you know what's happening now? Ethiopia has become one of the fastest transforming countries in Africa. Why? Because in Meles, he had vision, he had clarity in what he wanted for the economy. Policy alignment was good, They put good policies in place. Some key ministers' institutional capacity was upgraded, but ethnicity became a big issue. And I'll come to that in a minute. And also partnership. But with Meles, partnership with the one party was said that he had to control his own agenda. He knew what he wanted, and he could tell our development that, no, we will do it our way, not your way. So there was close ownership, and that's why the transformation of Ethiopia has been one of the most spectacular. All these factors played a key role. But the ethnicity issue and the regionalism and the TLPF government and the various nationalities, the Eritrean issue, the Tigrayan issue, Amhara issue, and the divisions were so huge. And it was always clear to me that until the country came together around these issues, much of Ethiopia's transformation could be at risk. And I remember having several discussions with Prime Minister Meles on these issues. So what's happening in Ethiopia today that we're seeing is terrible. But these are long-seated. So in a sense, you cannot separate these issues. And you have to see them and deal. So those were the factors that I learned working in these African countries from my time at the bank, and also including the ECA. So I thought I should highlight the lessons by using these country examples to illustrate why policy matters, why institutional effectiveness and capacity matters, why country ownership is so critical, and why strong visionary leadership from the people who lead. That is the story that I wanted to share with you in terms of my country experiences. So with all that behind me, I arrived at the ECA in 1995. As I said, Brutus Gal called upon me to take that job. And in the book, I write about how I got there, the challenges I faced, the difficult decision I had to make. But it was a very exciting time to leave the World Bank to go to Africa. Why? Because for one thing, there was a, you can take the slide off, please. There was a new generation. Take this one off, not yet. There was a new generation of African leaders determined to assert African ownership of the development agenda. So I was talking about people like Obasanjo, people like Thabo Mbeki, Meles, and so on. That's when I got to the ECA. The Cold War was over, and there was an increasing focus by the international community on Africa's development. Finally, also, there was a recognition that Africa's debt crisis had to be resolved, and that we needed to place a focus on poverty reduction and meeting the MDGs, and which later became the SDGs after all the challenges and the problems with structural adjustment. So there was a realization that we needed to turn the tide in terms of the development paradigm for Africa. Also, most African countries have started growing. If you recall, in the 70s and most of the 80s, they were called the lost decade. Per capita GDP declined, poverty was increasing, but suddenly, around the mid-95s, growth rate started going up. So there was an increased sense of optimism. And most important also, one of the most important factors, which is relevant today, is that civil society organizations across the continent were pushing for greater transparency and accountability and a greater role in the developmental discourse. It's very important. And now today, as we know, civil society organizations are quite vibrant and playing an increasing role. That was not the case in the early 90s. So when I got to the ECA, the mandate that Boutros Ghali gave me was to extensively reform ECA, the first Pan-African institution that was created in 1958 and had played a critical role in supporting post-African independence. And just an aside, one of the executive secretaries, the second one, who stayed in ECA for a long time, who really put the organization on the path, was Robert Gardner, the Ghanaian. So when I was growing up in secondary school, Robert Gardner was my hero. And that's how I got interested in economics, because I heard him on the radio, BBC, talking about Africa. Little did I know that one day I'll be sitting in the same chair as Robert Gardner did. That was a critical role that the ECA played. But for many years before I got there, it had fallen hard times. Its reputation was in tatters due to poor and inconsistent leadership after Gardner, poor quality of analytical work, budgetary constraints, and low staff morale. So learning from the lessons about institutions matters, capacity matters. My first goal was to reform the organization, bring it up to speed, up here on institutional capacity and effectiveness. So in my book, I go into great detail. It's a classic example of how you reform an organization from the bottom to the top, including staff changes, looking at the strategy, the agenda of the organization, building partnership, totally revamping the management team, bringing new blood, setting a clear direction for what the organization needed to do to meet the times of Africa. It wasn't easy. Sometimes I felt I was in a war zone. Some of the staff were opposed to all the changes I was trying to make, particularly because I came from the World Bank. They didn't love the World Bank because of the structure I joined for good reasons. But the good news is that the majority of the staff saw the need for change. And they gathered around me. And in 2 years, we totally reshaped the organization to the extent that Boutros Ghali gave us a great endorsement when he said ECA was in the vanguard of reform within the UN system. Now I'm at the ECA, and when I looked at it, I found that I had to apply some of the same lessons that I had learned about institutions, about capacity, about policy. But this time, not at the country level, but the mandate was at the continental level. Therefore, to work with African leaders to bring initiatives that were underpinned by some of these same principles. So let me give you a few examples, because decay, you mentioned NEPAD, you mentioned APM, that was one, I'll come to that. But there were several. The first challenge I had, or what I saw was critically needed, was on the governance agenda. Now, a few years before I got there, a few African leaders had come together to talk about governance, about transparency, accountability, what it meant for Africa. So they came out with something called the Cairo Agenda for Action. And if you look at the Cairo Agenda for Action, they didn't use the word governance, but all the elements, all the principles were there. For Africa to move on, there has to be transparency, there has to be rule of law, there has to be accountability of leaders. All the principles were enshrined in the Cairo Agenda for Action, although they didn't use the phrase governance. So my challenge then, or I saw that, is take that, because the leaders have pronounced themselves on, let's make it an African-driven agenda on governance. So there were so many things we did. Convening meetings, bringing the countries to translate that into their own country's specificity. We later came out with the first African governance report with indicators to measure and compare countries. That was before the Mo Ibrahim Index, which is now famous, but that was the first of its kind, what we did. And we brought policymakers around, we convened meetings, big meetings, to share this. So governance became a huge agenda that I thought African leaders, an African continent. So that was one. In the same vein, we then took on some issues. Remember the HIV/AIDS crisis was ravaging the continent. And there was in denial. Most African countries, this is a health issue. People like President Mbeki were even doubting that HIV/AIDS existed. There was some international conference to talk about this. African leaders didn't show up. So one day I got a call from Peter Peart, who was head of UN, and said, KY, this is so important. Let's look about the economic impact. This is going to devastate the continent. So we did a major study. I said, oh my God. So I had a finance ministers meeting in Addis Ababa, and I showed them the results. This is not just a health crisis, just like COVID. It could devastate it. Jobs. People are dying in keep. So we need to have, and it's a leadership challenge. So what did we do? We had a conference, what I call the Africa Development Forum in Accra, in Addis. Brought Kofi Annan, head of the Secretary General at the time, all the heads of UN agency, about 6 African leaders. Museveni, he was great on this issue. Kawunda has stepped down, but he came because his son had died, and he was committed to it. Mohai, Festus Mohai of Botswana, because HIV/AIDS was a big problem in there. And then we had about 2,000 people, imagine for a whole week, people living with HIV/AIDS. And we came up with the HIV/AIDS consensus for Africa that everybody signed on to, because we said this is the greatest leadership challenge. And if we all don't confront it, it's going to devastate the country. So leadership matters here. That led to the Abuja Declaration, and later the OE then embraced this agenda. And so the margins of that meeting, that is that Kofi Annan put together the international effort for the Global Fund that George Bush and others supported. But because of African leaders came together and the African people and accepted this. So this is something that now I'm glad that when it comes to the COVID, some of these lessons have been learned, and our leaders have been excellent with the Africa CDC, with the institutions, with the AU. And say we have to settle the place, even in terms of vaccine destination. So ownership matters, leadership. So that's one on which I wanted to. And then on gender, which I'll come to, because gender has been one of my most important sort of things that I always talk about. And in my book, I write a lot about why. So the 40th anniversary of ECA, we had a major conference. That's 1998. And we're saying, look, African women emancipation and leadership and empowerment is going to be issue. That gender equality is an issue of both moral and economic imperative. So let's come around this issue. Again, Kofi Annan came with all the heads of the UN agencies, and out of that, a lot of initiatives came. So the whole idea then of gender parity or increased representation in parliament, getting countries to drive that came out of some of those conferences, and all that was after Beijing. And then final, here was the ICT revolution and innovations today. No, in 1995, when I got to the ECA, only 5 countries in Africa had internet connectivity. And I was advised that the ICT revolution is going to be so big in terms of, and Africa cannot afford to be behind. So we did so much, brought policymakers together, put up task forces, help countries develop what they call their national information and communication infrastructure plans and policies. Ghana was one, Rwanda and Kagame in particular really took it straight. Mozambique was another star, Kenya was another star. By 1990, it wasn't that. So we had to work together to bring this as an African agenda and to focus on policy matters, institutions matters. Let's go, and we bring the necessary partnership, but we have to own the agenda. So that, and then came NEPAD and the APRM. Let me briefly talk about that. NEPAD, the context of NEPAD was very interesting. There it was Mbeki, Obasanjo, and Wad, and later Bouteflika came into the picture. But the issue was the G8 was meeting on Africa, but the African leaders were not sure where the agenda was going. So they say, we have to drive this. Let's come up with our own program around which we can bring the partnership. So when we talk about new partnership, the partnership was about partnership with developed world and the donors, a partnership around an African agenda that we collectively thought was important. And we use that agenda also to rally our people, our governments around, and then bring in the donors. That was the simple position. But how to get there was not easy. So I found myself broken this relationship between these leaders, traveling from place to place, all sorts of disagreements. But finally, it came together and was presented to the G8. But what I loved about it was a commitment that people like Mbeki, Obasanjo, when they came together, could show what African leaders collectively could do at the continental level. And then out of that came the APRM. The APRM story is that I felt very strongly that when you talk about relations with donors and conditionality, we're all criticizing the structural adjustment, too much conditions. And I said, okay, yeah, it's external imposed, but why don't we have a process internal within Africa where we can have our own conditionality and measure and challenge each other for impact? So we studied a lot of such. The OECD had its own peer review mechanism. So we said, okay, let's have one for Africa that we can come together. But frankly, the design ultimately of the APRM was very faulty. And I remain very disappointed up to today in terms of what it has achieved. But that's another story. But in those days, we did it. Related to that was how we wanted to work with the donors. So we also put in place a process where African ministers and the OECD ministers could meet on an equal footing to talk candidly about the African agenda. So we created something, the big table, where every year I brought together about 10 or 15 African finance ministers and planning, and a similar number of development cooperation ministers from the UK, from Germany, from Norway, from the US, to talk candidly about the African agenda and agree on what needed to be done. And that's how we transformed the whole aid relationship in terms of getting African countries to own the agenda. There was something about frustration with too many conditions and transaction costs, move to budget support, a whole range of issues that went to the Paris agenda, the Accra agenda. So we changed the whole relationship and the dialogue. Now, let me talk here in that context about the whole issue which President Akufo-Addo has been so eloquent about Ghana Beyond Aid. Because the Beyond Aid agenda, it also comes from the lessons we've learned that we cannot depend upon aid together. So aid is still important, but so through this process, we wanted to make that. Finally, regional integration, and I'll come to that later, the work we did at the ECA in terms of ensuring that regional institutions, the think tanks and all that. So we did that part on the regional integration, and that's why I'm very proud that we are hosting the AFC-FTA Secretariat, because one thing that I've learned is that when it comes to regional integration, institutions matter. And I hope we can do all we can to make the Secretariat in Accra very effective. So those are the points I want in terms of the lessons I learned from the ECA and also at the bank and how we can apply them. So now let me turn to Ghana now, a bit more in terms of the topic of governance. I've made several speeches in Ghana in the past. If I recall, this is about the 7th one that I'm making. I spoke at Senchi Forum, I spoke at Legon a couple of times. I talked about, and out of all those speeches that are delivered, certain themes have been constant through. So I'll take this slide off. I want to come to what I've been talking about Ghana for a while. But it's important that I bring this because I've reflected on some of the points that I've been saying over the many, through all the speeches I've been making. And through that, I've been struck by how long I've been saying some of the same things. That through multiple presidential administrations, through economic ups and downs, we see that trust in our public institutions in Ghana is on the decline. That's one fact. We also see that trust is undermined by a perception of pervasive corruption, patronage, and a perception that extends beyond public officials to the business community, that state capacity to drive economic transformation is lacking due to sometimes inefficient and wasteful spending. Importantly, I also believe that after 20 years of successful economic elections and peaceful transfer of power, there have been some fault lines in our election processes and in our democratic processes. And all these have had some impact on them. But the main point I want to make here is that we've not been consistent over time in pursuing our economic agendas. And the disruption of one administration coming in, sometimes starting for scratch, you don't see a continuity in policies. And without that continuity, and for example, you look at Ghana, government comes in, then there are interruptions, and we go to the IMF for bailout. We are now 16th bailout in 2019. It's because it's inconsistent policies and continuity and wasteful. So that's something that I have always felt strongly about. And I also see that our transformation as a country, economic transformation, as I said, we have something we call the African Transformation Index, where we track how countries are transforming according to some metrics. We have another report coming out later this year. It will show that Ghana falls within the middle of the countries in Africa. We are not in the top rank after all these years, so that worries me a lot. So I've referred to this duality, that on the one hand, we are praised for our democracy, we have peaceful elections, we are a beacon of transformation of democracy, but when it comes to our economic development and the process and the transformation, these have become some form of an impediment. So I wanted to bring that, but I think now the point I want to say is that we have a real opportunity now to come together as a nation, to learn from the past. And why? Because the COVID crisis we are facing is extraordinary. The good news is that at the beginning of the crisis, the government did something very important that we should commend it for. It came out with this CARES Ghana program that I mentioned. It has very great elements, the speed in which it moved to bring it up. It is comprehensive and inclusive. It's coordinated. It's a lot of resources going to them. And it's also aligned to our medium-term strategy of Ghana Beyond Aid. So in my view, the government has developed quite a robust and detailed plan for economic rebound and recovery. But like in most other African countries, we are seeing a regression in education, jobs, and income. Therefore, looking forward, it is critical that we focus not just on how to rebound from COVID, but use it as a way to track our long term. The CARES program, as I say, is fantastic, and Ghana's an example of Ghana, what Ghana can deliver once we put our minds to it. So we should all rally around it and come together to implement it. And I want to say, over the next 4 years in particular, we need to do so. And collaboration will be critical. No single party has a large majority in parliament. To recover and rebound, much less to aim for something bigger, we must all work together. The economic and health circumstances of our nation demands it. So, looking forward now, we need to withstand future shocks. And as a first step, I suggest what we need to do is to build a national consensus on some of the key issues that I've been talking about today, but also in some of my previous, around some what I call some long-term challenges we face. Many of the solutions to our problems are well known. They have been the subject of debate and discussion for many years in the media, at Parliament, during political campaigns, within churches, and among traditional and religious leaders. In particular, if you recall, in 1992, or 2012, I'm sorry, the Constitutional Review Commission came up with a 1,000-page report from a political to a development constitution. That report was informed by millions of Ghanaians and was intended to reorient our constitution forward. So what I'm saying is that we are not starting from square one. A lot of ideas are on the table as to how to move our country forward. The challenge is to take them, build a consensus around them, have a process of consultation, and with clarity and buy-in. This has been said before, but I'm saying with the COVID crisis and looking at the future, now is the time to do that, because we should not let the crisis go to waste and build upon what is best for us and what we know we can do well. So on the chart there, I've identified what I call some pillars around which we can build such a consensus. And in studying this, I know many examples in other parts of the world where at critical times, governments and citizens came together. I can mention Peru, for example, where they realized that nutrition and childcare was so important. I can mention India, where they realized that economic policy over a number of periods, we had to get all the political parties to agree on some set targets that whichever government comes into power would maintain those standards, regardless of what. And that moved India at a critical time where over a decade, it became one of the fastest growing countries because of that buy-in. If you look at Kenya, even now on the political side, there's the Kenya Building Bridges Initiative, where there's widespread consultation going on, starting in 2018 at the regional level, at the country level, by the two parties to see what are the common elements of Kenya's situation because of ethnic polarization, as you know, is very, very more intense. But at least they're going through the process. So that is what I have in mind, is that we know what the issues are, we know what the challenges are, we know what some of the solutions are. We are smart people, Ghanaians, we know them. But how do we come together? Achieve a consensus and say, for the sake of our nation, let's come together. We can compete in parliament or in elections around issues, but we should have a common framework around which we agree. So that's why I put this on the table, on the broad areas of where such a consensus will be important. So I say first, pillar one, the Constitution. There are some provisions in the four Constitution Republic that we need to, I think it's been agreed, including the devolution of power to the regions or the local governments. And there was a referendum that didn't happen, unfortunately, but we know it's needed. Our elections, we need to ensure that our election processes are fair and impartial so that we don't go through this every 4 years. It's critical. Political parties, we need to look at the way our political parties function so that they can have the betterment of the country. They need to compete, but even how you finance our elections or our political parties, those are issues that we need to think about and put on the table. Our media, very proactive, but still the media should be the safeguard of our democracy. But the way the media operates and the media ownership, sometimes they also impede upon some of these core principles. So media relationship is important, and our public sector. And I have some ideas there: open governments, accountability and transparency, holding civil servants accountable. There are methods that other countries have used, and it works. So we can learn from that too. And women are women. It's embarrassing where Ghana is on the issue of gender equality. We have only 13% or so parliamentarians who are women. In Kenya, in Rwanda, it's 57. So we're not doing well. We're not doing well on gender parity. So that's an area I feel. Do we want to have quotas? Yeah, sure. Then maybe let's have quotas, if that's what it would take. But at the pace we are going, gender equality at all levels is not going to happen. And then our youth, jobs. We need a new generation of youth. I mean, on the youth, when you look at the quality of education and what we call the human capital index, and where Ghana stands on the human capital index, it's not good, which means our education and the quality of education we are giving to our children in their productive years, their productivity will be very low because we are not laying the real foundations. There are statistics for that. We are 0.4, and that's the World Bank. So we need to do better how we test education. And the free secondary education was a key issue. It was a great idea because it's important. But the way we implement it is also important. And it should not be the subject of political, we don't want free secondary. No, that's not should be the issue. How should we make it work better? So we know the answers. Our examples around the world. Can we seize the moment? And finally, I'll say our private sector. The private sector should be a partner for governments. Government sets the overall vision in consultation with all of us to provide the enablement, but it's a private sector that has to create the jobs and the investments. So what are the challenges? Again, here too, we know the answers. But how do we come together and set an agenda, set it forward, rally around it? So these are the 7 pillars, and some of you may have heard me calling for something I call a compact for political and economic transformation, building upon these processes. And I hope I will have the opportunity soon to discuss further with you. Now, as you heard me so far, I've been talking a lot about the future and not the past. I've talked about the past, but all comes down to the future. And when it comes down to the future, it comes to the youth. They will build on what we've done. This is what, in fact, how I conclude my book, with a vision for the future. But what that means for the youth in Ghana and Africa, I can't emphasize enough how important I believe this to be. I said at the start that I want to speak on governance, democracy, and development. We must indeed take the steps to show our youth, that we can have a solid, stable democracy that works for them by promoting growth and development. Some of Africa's most successful transforming countries thus far have not been multi-party democracies. But democracy and development do not have to be at odds. This is the legacy we can build for our youth and for our future. For me, I look to the future through the eyes of my own grandchildren. And I'm sure many of you do the same. So allow me to conclude with a passage from my book that I want to share with you. After I've outlined that vision and what it could mean for my granddaughter, Mina, who lives in Accra. This is what I write in the book. And this is my final words. We have more than enough data to make an educated guess on the pathway to transform Africa. I do not know if Mina, my granddaughter, will see the Ghana I have just described, or the future of the country and the continent that I have envisioned my whole life. But I hope she does. And I believe she will. My journey is nearing its completion or conclusion. Her journey, and a better one for Africa, is just beginning. Thank you very much for your attention. And may God bless you all.
A call for action. You're suggesting that given the experiences that we've had in Africa in relation to governance, democracy, and development, perhaps in the case of Ghana, a crisis situation where we've had COVID-19 plus a fairly balanced distribution in parliament, we need to consider establishing what you called a compact over which we can have a national dialogue and an agreement as the basis for our development. I noticed you talked a lot about gender, about the role of the private sector, about the participation of the youth, about the manner in which we organize our elections. You talked about potential constitutional reforms, which can play an important role in the transformation of our country. I really think that we should consider from this point how we're going to translate this charge into concrete steps. And I want to recommend that from this presentation, you lead a process of further discussion among like-minded Ghanaians who believe that this is the moment to try and bring the nation together to see if we can develop an agenda which can move Ghana forward. I am particularly concerned about the historical analysis you had about the pillars for effective economic transformation in Africa. I remember I noticed when you were talking about your experiences in the countries, you had a number of benchmarks, and there was the presumption that a country in which there was good governance, there was visionary leadership, there was institutional capacity, there were partnerships built, and where there was policy alignment, there was the likelihood that there will be economic development. Kewa, am I right? I hope you can hear me. Oh, sorry, I think Kewa, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well. I can hear you, but the sound is, I think, the okay, connectivity.
I was saying that in drawing on your experiences in Africa, when you talked about good governance, when you talk about your experience in Kenya, about Zambia, about Sudan, there were benchmarks which you set, and there was the presumption or assumption that in countries which had visionary leadership, the existence of good governance, which had institutional capacity, where there were partnerships built, and where there was policy alignment, the likelihood was that there would be economic development. Yeah. I got that impression. So before we start our question, yes, before we start our question and answer session, which will be moderated by the editor of our journal, the Venerable Ivo. Let me ask you an impression I get from your book before I hand over to Ivo. I seem to get the impression that you are suggesting that wherever there is the existence of a very open political space in Africa, economic development has not necessarily followed. Empirically speaking, am I right or wrong? I get that impression from your book that, I mean, a very open, competitive political environment.
No, yeah. Okay, let's take a few country examples.
Okay.
I think there's a big debate in the literature about what we call the developmental state approach and what we call the multi-party democracy approach. And the developmental state approach are countries where you don't have governments changing power from one election to the other, where you have a strong man. And I think glad you're using this example, because if you talk to most people today, especially the youth in Africa, they will tell you that in Rwanda, and maybe before then in Ethiopia, but let's just use Rwanda. Rwanda is making a huge difference, progress on transformation. Mali's made a huge difference in transformation because it was more or less a one-party state, and they can move, take decision, move on. On the contrary, in multi-party democracies like Kenya or Ghana, where back and forth, that continuity is not there. It's not there. And that's why people sometimes say, oh, maybe democracy and development are at odds. And that's why I'm talking about Ghana. Is that on the one hand, we've had great democratic principles, we're a beacon of democracy. But when you look at it in terms of the back and forth, we are at the pace, and Mali's, the transformation was spectacular. He didn't have to worry about Kagame, it was spectacular. But what I'm saying, and that's why I said that even in our multi-party democracy in Ghana, provided we can resolve some of these differences and have a national consensus, we can make progress. So that's the main point. We should be proud of what we have, but use it, identify the challenges we have and fix it so that we can also see, and we can be a model of a multi-party democracy that goes hand in hand with development. That's the point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, KY. And I hand over to Ivo Ajmanduya, who will take you through the Q&A session. Ivo.
Thank you, Ambassador BKOSA. And thank you, Dr. KY AMOAKO, for sharing your experiences with us. These can only come about through experience and not only through other forms of knowledge. We'll begin with a couple of questions. And the first one has to do with the African Continental Free Trade Area, which provides great opportunities for Africa and Ghana. And Ghana, of course, has been a champion of this. How do you see the Secretariat's implementation so far?
Well, I don't think I can say much about the Secretariat's implementation so far, because it's very new, it just started, the AU. So, but let me say how thrilled and how we should congratulate our government for working so hard to bring the Secretariat to Accra. That's the first point I want to say. In terms of the lessons learned, let me go back to the ECA. Regional integration, I didn't talk enough about that, so I'm glad you're giving me this opportunity. There is nothing more important to African economic transformation than integration. And when you look at the history of regional integration from the Abuja Treaty to today, it's not been spectacular, okay? So at ECA, I looked into that, and we actually did what we call the annual assessment of regional integration in Africa. So each year or every other year, EC started coming out, which they still do. And then I actually created the Africa Trade Policy Center at the EC, because I felt that on the trade issues and intra-regional trade, we needed a lot more to do. So with that Africa Trade Policy Center, that has done a lot of the work. Since I left. So given that history, I'm delighted. Then if I go into the future, and as I said, we come out with a new report this year, talking about using the challenges for Africa, and we're putting about integration at the center of it. And the history of integration is about history of institutions. If you don't have the right secretary and the right institution driving it, that then work with the political leaders to make it happen, it becomes a lot of talk. So my worry is that there's a lot of euphoria about it. The principle of free trade, regional public, all the ideas under the AFCT, but implementation of it is going to be, and to have a strong, robust secretariat that can drive it, bring people together, track progress, bring the political leaders when things are not moving. It's going to be a heavy lift. So we need to support the secretariat, need to work with them. Actually, there are some initiatives I'm already taking on that. Next week, I'm having a meeting with many of the development partners, including the AFDB president and others, the World Bank. And one of the issues we're talking about is the AFC, how we can have coordinated support for the secretariat. So that will be my answer. We should be proud that Ghana has the secretariat there, but we should all work with the secretariat. And I personally am very committed to working with them to draw upon my experience and other.
Hello?
And bring Africa's economic transformation.
The second question is that the Africa Center for Economic Transformation conducts a lot of research on Africa, including Ghana. What are some of the areas you are engaging now?
Oh, several areas. You know what, like I said, we put the transformation agenda on the table in 2008, and every 3 years we come up with a major report. In between, we do so many other work, both in Ghana and across the continent. For now, my biggest preoccupation, in fact, we're coming up with a report, the next African Transformation Report in a few months from now, where we've looked at 4 issues. That to me is going to be central to Africa's transformation and growth, in addition to all the things we said. One is the whole issue of climate change, how we handle the issues. The second issue is also of innovations and technology, which I touched upon. Then jobs for the youth, and also regional integration, as I've said. So we are working on this, and the report will come out very soon, where we will come out with some major recommendations for African governments and African, in terms of some of the best practices, what's working somewhere, and how we draw from that. And there's going to be also Ghana specifics. So that is one. We're also looking at issues working with the Compact with Africa, with the Germans and the G20 on the whole range of issues. For example, looking at the pathways for investments. We've looked at Ghana and 7 other countries, and we see in Ghana, manufacturing and agriculture are the top sectors where we need to work with the government for our economic transformation, issues of industrial innovations and landscape. Again, these are areas where it's important. And then on the COVID recovery that I mentioned already, when the pandemic hit, we came up with what we call the 10-point policy priorities for African governments in terms of the immediate economic rebound and the long-term growth, some of which I talked about. And Ghana was one of those we talked about. And if you look at the Ghana Cares program, there's some alignment in what the Ghana Cares program and what the asset report is saying. Working with the World Bank and others, we are helping specific countries, including Ghana, in aspects of their economic COVID transformation programs. So those are some of the areas where ASSET is working on. we take the issue of youth and employment and skills very, very important. So we are working in about 6 African countries, including Ghana, with the policymakers. Look at the youth skills programs, TVET, STEM trainings, so as to get the youth the skills they need. So these are all in the context of economic transformation.
You have been very concerned with policy leadership and also implementation of policy. Your idea of a compact for Ghana sounds great. Do you foresee the same challenges you talk about in other countries and also in our internal conditions?
Yeah, Ivo, let me tell you something. I'm an optimist. And I learned long ago that when you work on Africa, you have been an optimist. And there are many, many definitions of who an optimist is. And I'll tell you one. And that's why I said, I look at from the eyes of my grandchildren. And when every day I think about that, not today, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when most of us are gone, what is the future that we want to leave from them? Then you have no choice to do the right thing. So this compact idea may sound daunting, may sound difficult, but like I said, I know countries where at various times in their life, they did. And let me tell you about Zambia. Zambia had a huge crisis when I was in there. And Ken Kaunda decided, I consulted with him, we brought the trade unions together, the labor, the churches, everybody, for something they called the National Convention for a whole week to debate the issues. And they came out with the consensus on key issues. And that's what moved the country forward. So it's been done elsewhere. I just mentioned what Kenya has done. I just mentioned what Peru has done. I just mentioned India. There are processes. So it seems, and what the case said, let's consult, let's bring a few people together. I should be in Ghana in the next couple of months, and I want to devote time talking to all of you and others. But if we put our minds to it, and we agree that this is what we can do it. It's been, others have done it. There's no reason. You also can. So I'm not daunted by this idea, but it requires the commitment of us, our political leaders, everybody to say, now that's why I think, as the case said, with the COVID crisis, and look at the numbers and the impact on health, on jobs, that is going to be lingering. It's going to be lingering. So now is the time. So if we believe this kind of consultation and identifying and coming together as a nation, then it has to be done. And it can be done. But it will take all of us to be committed for a better future for our country. We have so much going for us, but we can do better. That would be my response.
Dr. AMOAKO, this has been a very enjoyable evening with you, and we thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and your nationalism with all of us. For those who are interested in getting copies of Dr. AMOAKO's book, there are some few copies left with the University of Ghana bookshop, that is Kingdom Bookshop, and also Vidya Bookshop at Laboni and Osu. So I'll hand the mic over to Ambassador Dike to give the concluding remarks.
May I make a point before you do so?
Thank you. We're not going to conclude. In fact, I was going to open the floor for questions. So the first question will come from our dear friend, Emmanuel Akwete from IDEC. Emmanuel, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Dike and President. This is a great opportunity because I think the convergence of minds on we haven't had as good a time as now to make the structural changes we need in our political setup and also in economics so that we can do the economic and political transformation that we need. Usually the generational span for transformation is 30 years. So very soon we see 30 years coming, whether it's for our political democracy and under the 1992 Constitution. But I believe that the work we do, we have seen great change and significant opportunity to find ways of beginning to push for this change in the next 4 years. And the reason why I say that is that in 2019, December 1st, there were discussions about constitutional amendments and those things, looking particularly at local government. And local government has become the entry point to bringing about the reforms we've not undertaken since 2000, when agitation and various demands to amend the Constitution started. But the president put it on the table. And what was interesting is that a compact requires you to build consensus. We don't know how to build consensus in Ghana, unfortunately, I should tell you. And it failed because where we thought we had built consensus, when the issues came out, it was divisions all around within the major parties, between civil society, in parliament, and then the cancellation came. But I think the post-election situation holds some promise, and it does in a number of ways. I'll run through this quickly. Why I think the compact idea can be worked on, but we have to define the approach that helps us build consensus. When the president canceled the referendum, he said if we gave him a second term of office, he was elected to a second term, he would bring the issues back. We've seen the NPP that was so divided about whether parties should be allowed to go into local government and that should take precedent over just electing MPs and so on, put both the election of chief executives of local government and the whole reform of the local government structure in their manifesto. And then we saw NDC also saying, oh, well, all the reforms we also fought for CRIC, we'll put it on the table. The electorate's decision is that we have to find a way, is the clearest signal yet that people are getting fed up with the winner-takes-all system. And we've seen how the president interpreted it to mean, oh, they're saying we should work together. Working together in parliament, where already the institution is designed to accommodate different sections and working together, whether it's committee chair or ranking member, whether it's deputy leader or minority or whatever. We have seen how they've done this, and we are talking about hung parliament. But the crucial area where we need to work together, where the compact and other things need to be really, really handled, is in the executive arm. And the executive arm has no institutional framework for just arriving, easily taking on the vote, what the voters say, and then say, look, yes, here we go. You go here, you go there. The institutional design doesn't allow it. Everything is concentrated at the executive level, the executive president. So fortunately, the president talks about devolving power and resources to regions, districts, and local level. This is his idea, but concrete proposals to deliver that is not on the table. And he says the reason why he wants to do that is to transform the rural economy, the local economy. And I think we have now come to a point where indeed he cannot move without working with the parliamentary situation. You have to amend constitution and you have to work in parliament. And none of them can move anything if they do not find the cooperation and agree, build consensus. At the same time, in the executive level, local government, you cannot make changes without the two sides having to work together. But we've also heard from chiefs. We've heard from women's organizations, business organizations of women's, and they are all saying that you can't leave us out of this. So you might see that, well, we're all beginning to see that, hey, we are all part of the have to be made now to bring various actors together around the table, because there's a point of entry. And both sides now see that we need institutional reforms. that will also impact on economic transformation in the country. Thank you. And so I commend KY, my dear friend and mentor. We engage a lot. Thank you.
Dr. Akwete, thank you very much. In your comments, you said something which caught my attention. You said we are incapable of building consensus. Now, if we are incapable of building consensus, then it means that our compact idea is dead on arrival. And I believe that is the challenge. If indeed we're in the past we've shown to be incapable of building consensus, the cry for coming together will involve learning how to build consensus. And I'm hoping that when this group gets together, Emmanuel, you'll find the time to join like-minded people to think through these problems that you've suggested. I understand that Kweku, member of the council group, Shadow, has a question for you, KY. Kweku, if you're online, Dr. AMOAKO will take your question.
Thank you, thank you very much, Dr. KY, this insightful lecture. And let me say congratulations also to CFR and the team on the second anniversary and for putting this anniversary lecture together. Thanks very much. So Mike, because you left there, you worked with, you shared your malice to deliver the miracle that we've seen in the last Nigeria, because it is a giant neighbor, and what happens in Nigeria is affects us in West Africa and much of Africa. And then my second question is about, you talked about the strongman approach to development. What happens when the strongman away? How much of a risk? Surely, let me put it this way, surely there's a risk.
Goodbye.
Give us the private sector and jobs for young people. And I am for private sector because in what we're seeing in Ghana is one wanting a government job or a job after the year 2000, till maybe years ago, private sector was growing and people, and when they left school to work with the private sector, we're seeing a reversal. What must a government do to reverse this reversal and grow the private sector? Three key things that a government must do. Thank you very much.
Well, you always ask very penetrating questions.
Thank you. I take that as a compliment.
That's a great journalist. I remember you used to quiz me when I was at the ECA. So,
indeed.
Always glad to hear from you. On your first question, Ethiopia, I'm glad you asked. Look, I spent 10 years there. I worked a lot with Meles and his government. Indeed, I write in the book, each time there was an AU summit, he would give me in any part of Africa, we traveled together on his flight, on his plane, we talk a lot. Sometimes he'd call me to his office. I worked with him on the Commission for Africa with Tony Blair and some of the other leaders. So we talked a lot. My worry about, and I admire the man very much, one of the most intelligent people, penetrating minds that you can ever meet. He had that. He also knew how to identify people and bring them around him to get results. So I can go on and on and on and on. But there was one dimension, the history of Ethiopia, as you know, from the Haile Selassie to Mengistu, how the TRP came, the Eritrea situation. I was in Addis when the Eritrea-Ethiopia war. I had to go and see Isaias in Eritrea to talk to him about the dangers. So I've seen the Ethiopia course and I've seen their progress. But I always had one worry. Can this country hold together? Given the ethnicity and the regional tensions and historic, and was merely science people doing enough to bring them together? The Ethiopian diaspora have bright, intelligent people, and they were vocal. How do we make them part of the solution and the debate? They never seized the moment, never seized the opportunity. And the structure of the constitution was such. Also, it didn't help bringing people together. So there were divisions were deep. Nobody had the answer. And as I write in my book, when Abe came in and got the Nobel Prize, I write in the last chapter of my book, I said, I hope this could be the beginning of bringing everybody together and resolving this problem. It hasn't happened. On the contrary, it's done the other way around. And you are foreign ministers. When I hear some of the people in Ethiopia, like Seyu Mesfin, the foreign minister Tigran, who has been killed, this is where my heart goes. I don't have an answer. And I don't think anybody has an answer. So the best we can do is to pray. The UN and everybody is very concerned. I don't have an answer. I wish I could. But Ethiopia's stability is important to Africa and to the region. But I don't have the answer. I've seen it. I couldn't say I predicted it. I was hoping it couldn't happen, but it's happened. On Nigeria, I've thrown the Nigeria question. You guys are much closer Nigeria, you're right in the sense that, is the biggest. So between Nigeria and South Africa, if we're talking about all these things we're talking about, as goes Nigeria, South Africa, and a few of the big countries, goes the rest of Africa. As an economist, I see that. If you're talking about AFCFTA, all these issues that one can, Nigeria's role is very critical. And you see what's happening in Nigeria and the Buhari, I'll be honest about it, poor leadership. And all these challenges, and Nigeria has its own history. And it's up to the Nigerians to do it. So Nigeria is critical for our stability, our growth. But you look at the history of Nigeria, but oh my God, are they entrepreneurial? The Nigerian, if I was reading an article in one of the US newspapers recently, tells you the Nigerians are the most educated in the US. When you look at the number of Nigerians with PhD proportion here, it tells you what this country can do. How do you use it back home? So that's the paradox, but I don't have an answer. Then your second question is a good one. I spent a lot of time talking about strong leaders and what it means. And I've studied the East Asian example. You all know Lee Kuan Yew, all those people. And as DK said, transformation is a long-term process. It takes 20 or 30 years. The advantage of that strongman rule, I say the advantage, that if he's the right leader and he stays a long term, he can drive the agenda and make tremendous progress. That's the good news. You see it. And it's happening in Singapore, it's happening in all these people. In Africa, it's happening in Rwanda. That's why people say the Rwanda model works. But some of them have their major costs. So I'm not recommending that type of, but I'm recognizing what are the challenges. But your question is what happens when the strong man leaves? It depends upon how he leaves and what he puts in his place. Singapore and some of these places, they had the succession and the happens. So if you don't, and I remember Kagame saying, when people criticize him, He said, look, it's not what you do, it's what you leave behind that matters. So he leaves what he leaves behind and who he puts in plan the process. And if he can continue, but on the other hand, if he doesn't, then the whole thing falls apart. So there's no, I don't have an easy answer. But that comes back to what I'm saying about Ghana. Every country is different. Every country's history is different. Rwanda is different. After genocide, that he had to build to move forward. We are different. We have the Fourth Republic. My God, it's multi-party democracy. We are not going to go back on it. So how do we make it better? It's what we have. It's worked for us in many instances. It's not perfect. And that's why my passion about coming together, because it's what we have and it's great. I'm not saying we should give it up and go and do something differently, but we should see what the fault lines and how we make it. And if we can, then we have the best of both worlds. That's what I'll say on that, on terms of the strong man. And then finally on the private sector, oh, I could go on forever. In fact, Asset is doing a lot of work here in Ghana. So maybe I can get my colleagues at Asset to get in touch with you, Chrissy, and give you some of the, it's so exciting because you're right. It's the private sector that has to create the jobs. It's the private sector that has to pay the taxes more or less, go with domestic resources. There's so much. The private sector should be at the table when we are talking about the vision of where we will. The government has to use unnecessary regulations that hamper private sector development and let them go and create the jobs. And on that score, small and medium enterprise development is key. So we know what the answers are, and ASA is doing a lot of work here. Major studies with value-added addition here, and my friends at ASET, and in the next couple of, a few months, we'll be having a lot of discussions on the way forward, engaging the governments and the private sector in particular to find solutions. But the private sector is the key to our success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Kweku, and thank you, KY. KY, I see that you're a great fan of Meles Zenawi. KY, do you hear me? KY, can you hear me?
I hear you, DK.
I see
yes,
that
I can.
You're a great fan of Meles Zenawi. Is that so?
Yes.
I asked the question because so am I. I'm a great fan of Meles. And interestingly, Meles said to me one day that the period that he spent in Ghana as a medical student in KNUST, that is when a lot of the ideas about changing the development paradigm came to him. Can you imagine that the great intellectual, great politician, leader, got a lot of those ideas whilst he was in Ghana and listening to the debate around? Anyway, I give the floor to Dr. Festus Obin. Festus, if you are on the line, KY will take your question. Dr. Obin, can you hear me? Dr. Obin is not online. Nashiru Abdullahi.
I see Joe Atamensa has his hand up.
Oh, Atamensa, before you, let's take a question from Nashiru Abdullahi. Nashiru, are you online?
Yes, please, I'm online, sir.
We'll take your question. KY is ready for you.
Thank you very much, Excellency, and good evening. I posted my question on the chat box. I was asking that looking at the current unemployment rate in Africa, about 70% of the youth are unemployed, and 70% of the African population too are youth. What is his take on the retirement age put by member states. And in Ghana, the retirement age is 60. In other countries, is 65. Are we giving opportunities to the youth? Thank you very much, sir.
Well, this is a tough one. I think it's more complicated than that. I think you can bring down the retirement age. I really don't think that necessarily solves the challenge. In the civil service, for example, I count the statistics I have, my people gave me. Let me see. Only, let me check. 9% of the civil service positions are people under 35. Only 9% are people under 35. So which means the civil service, at least, you don't have much youth going there. So that's an issue. But how do you create jobs for the youth? I think that's the issue that we need to look at. You talk about it's a young population, 25%, 57%, close to 60% of our population in Ghana are under the age of 25. So we need to create jobs for these people, and it's going to increase. And most of them are in the informal sector. So it's a huge challenge, a huge problem. It starts with the education system, the type of education they are getting. It looks also at giving the technical and vocational training system. It starts with private sector, government participation. So it's a huge agenda of creating jobs and progress youth employment, not only for Ghana, for Africa as a whole. And there are some models that have worked elsewhere. And as I said, we are working with the MasterCard Foundation on youth and employment strategies for 6 countries, including Ghana, where we are looking at all these issues and what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how you create jobs. And I'm talking about the education. So I hope we'll be able to share this report with you. And I also talk a little about the medium and small enterprise development. And that's where much of the jobs have to come from. So how we do that, value addition, bring more value addition. And the government also has these programs, planting for food. All those programs are important. For example, we strongly feel in ASET that the agricultural sector, there's so much employment that they can, even for graduates. By commercial farming, we need to look at our land tenure system that will make it possible. So job creation should be at the center of many of the things we do, and there are so many aspects of it. But like I said, we do a lot of studies that we can share, and I hope we can have some webinar sometime soon on this particular issue.
Thank you. Our friend from the ECA, Atamensa, are you online? And if you are, KY will take your question.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Osei. And it's great to be in the midst of KY. And let me let everyone know that I am at the ECA because he gave me the meal ticket to go to ECA. And I profited a great deal from his work. And I always remember that we would get together when he has ideas, we'll sit around and he'll be expecting us to give our inputs, but we're all there just to drink from his wealth of wisdom. So thank you so much. Sir, I have just a few questions or maybe comments. You raised the point about in Ghana where there's no continuity whenever there's a change in government.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether maybe it has something to do with our civil service, and therefore maybe ties it into the question that you have of strong institutions, and whether maybe our civil service should be reformed in a way that it takes politics out, and therefore the technician, the head of the technician, the chief director or the principal secretary has a strong power to be able to recruit and have good people. Because you refer to Singapore. Singapore, I think, has a very effective civil service, and it makes sure that always it attracts the best minds to do that. The other thing which I thought also related to the question of institutions, what your thoughts may be in terms of election and financing. Because my experience is that if you don't have money, you can't get into to stand. And there are good people, somebody like Ambassador DK Osei, somebody who I wish he could stand for parliament somewhere to represent, and he would do a fantastic job. But maybe he may not, he will look into his resources and he realizes that he has to probably mortgage his house in order to go into that kind of elections. So how do you think that, how can we change the election system so that financing is addressed so that people who are well qualified could be there? And my last point relates to the COVID and the situation, given that Africa, and this is something which you were very passionate about when it came to debt. And I remember before you left, it was an issue that we were struggling with in ECA, discussing a lot. And my point here is that, sir, you realize that a lot of African states have borrowed in order to save lives and have borrowed in order to put the economy back on track. Yes, the World Bank and the G20 have given this break of the debt, what do you call it? I don't know, I forgot it, DSSI.
DSI.
Yeah, DSI, which allows them to postpone payments on the interest. But in 2 years or when it's removed, the countries will be back to the same place. And before COVID, a number of African countries, including our country, Ghana, was in a very precarious situation when it came to the debt to GDP ratio. What are your thoughts in terms of, as we go forward, what we should do in terms of how Africa can really, really be able to achieve domestic resource mobilization, which is something which you are very passionate about, in order to address this heavily dependence on external borrowing? Once again, I thank you very much.
Thanks, Ojo, and I hope you guys in Addis do very well.
Oh, I'm hiding in Ottawa.
Ottawa. Okay. Now, on your first question about the civil service, I think I didn't go into much detail because one of the pillars I said was the public sector. And when you looked at that, some years ago, CDD, and I said we did a major study on, it was some term of institutions in Ghana. We looked at the civil service, we looked at the judiciary. We did a perception study to see what Ghanaians talk about our key institutions. That was several years ago. And it was alarming what people said about our civil service. And, in the old days, I'm much older than you, Joe, so you may not remember when we had this strong civil service after the colonial, and then the permanent secretaries were in charge. And DK will remember. But over time, that whole sort of structure and the professionalism of the civil service, and we changed it to chief directors, it became very political. I think we've done a lot of studies, even ASSET, on this issue in the past, though it's a problem. And the good news is that there are a lot of experiences that have happened, good things happen elsewhere. There's something called open government partnership. And the open government partnership comes together to see what are some of the most important techniques we can use to bring the capacity of institutions, particularly the civil service, where you bring transparency, accountability, where you ensure that sort of responsibility, division of responsibility are clear, where you can show that you can even track programs and budgets and to see how resources are being allocated. There's a whole open government partnership that we can learn. Ghana is a member of the open government partnership, but we are not making progress there. So this is an area just to, I will not have it. If we go with this consensus building, I believe in lessons learned. You can find what has worked, so we can find solutions. So that's my idea, but you're right. The civil service issue and the efficiency and the capacity and issue of accountability and for results of civil service, there are so many related issues, not that simple. But once we identify what they are, we can deal with them, provided there's a political will there. And that's why I talk about this compact, that's why I talk about this consensus, because if all the political parties agree that it's an area we need to work at, then okay, let's find solutions. But if we don't, so that's my answer there. On election financing, I don't know, I'm going to tell something to Ambassador Diko, say maybe he will never try and run for parliament. If you look at the latest Economist magazine, there's a very interesting article about parliaments in Africa and why being an MP is so expensive. And they quote some parliamentarians in Uganda, and this man says it cost him about $200,000. And just for the elections, but that's not the end of it. After the elections, he goes to his village, he has to give money to this person, he has to do this, he has to go to the church, he has to go to the funeral. So the financial cost of being an MP, both to run for the elections and is huge. I don't know, I don't have similar statistics in Ghana, but I'm sure you can imagine. I'm sure you have your own stories. So is this tenable? And that's where the patronage comes in. So election financing and this is critical. Again, here too, we have to recognize, first of all, that there's an issue. And if you recognize there's an issue, then we say, okay, what do we do about it? So in terms of campaign financing and the role of the political parties and how they finance their elections, this is worldwide, so it's not simple. But first of all, we need to recognize that's an issue. And so then on debt and COVID, you're right. The debt crisis we faced then when I was at the ECA, recall, and we did a HIPIC, enhanced HIPIC, brought African finance ministers together, pushed for major breakthrough on HIPIC and Africa a lot, so the debt crisis went away. But the debt crisis we are facing today, so it's a different nature. Interestingly, in terms of, I just got an invitation for the Chief of Counsel of the World Bank to participate in April in the discussion on this issue, for me to draw lessons from the past, to see where the debt crisis today is in Africa, and what the bank and the fund. So I'm going to give some more thought to it as part of this invitation. But today, a lot of the debt, the China debt is an issue. The private sector debt is an issue. Most of it is not to bilaterals and all that. So it's a whole different ball game. And so we need to find solutions to the debt and the financing issue. The good news is with the Biden administration coming on board now, the environment has changed. So hopefully we can make some progress if we come up with some real concrete burden upon some of the things we did. And as I said, we have this something called Transformation Leadership Panel that we created chaired by Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, and we bring all the major players together to put our minds around some issue and make recommendations. So this is not just me, we have a network. So I hope in the next couple of months, we'll be able to make some recommendations that can feed into wider G20 and G7 on the debt sustainability issues. It's quite complicated, but the good news is with the Biden administration, even the SDR allocation, so the IMF hopefully is going to get more resources now that they can use to support, yeah.
Thank you, KY. Ambassador Kanyerige Awinado, are you online? We can take your question now.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm online. Let me also thank our distinguished speaker for the very rich and mentoring exchange he's had with us, as usual. Two quick questions. The first one is to do with governance at the national and regional levels. And the second one on NEP.
On what, NEPAD?
Speaker highlighted about private sector. Women and youth, especially in support of SMEs, capacities and access to markets. And to remind that our traditional knowledge systems seem to be in a civil war with the modern knowledge systems. And in the sharing that we've had, especially knowing where it began, I wanted to ask our distinguished speaker, in terms of our national statecraft and our regional statecraft of regional integration, do you seem to get the impression that we are doing proper sankofa to tap into traditional knowledge systems which will guide us moving forward? Because the impression I get is that we are so focused on the modern and we are not learning from our own. So that is to do with the first question. Relating to the first question also, with your experience at the World Bank and ECA, I wanted to ask this geopolitical construct of Africa south of the Sahara and North Africa. We almost got Africa north of the Limpopo. Thank goodness it fizzled away. I was wondering, don't you find it to be a debilitating factor for our African integration agenda, where we seem to see things north and south? Now, in relation to NEPAD, and thank you very much for all the great work you did. I get the impression that NEPAD, there was a slippage of focus on the external, on the partners, rather than what you said, having a shared African agenda to mobilize our internal resources. I was wondering what you think about that and how we have been able to try to catch up on that. And once more, thank you so much for the kind sharing.
These are all very good questions, and some of them touch my soul. Especially, let me tell you the one that touches me most. I'm a real Pan-Africanist, and I hate this division of North, South, Sub-Saharan Africa. There's one Africa. And that's why I love that the ECA job, because we're one Africa. And in Nepal and all this, we managed to bring the whole of Africa together. So when you look at some of the work we did, it was interesting. Something like, let me give you one example. Air transport. It was a major challenge, moving aircrafts across the continent, the restrictions, until we brought all the ministers of aviation together in Yamoussoukro for a 3-day conference about opening African skies, making it possible for Ethiopia Airlines to fly here, giving landing rights to bind the African continent together. We had to go through that. It wasn't easy, but we did it. That shows you the power of a one Africa. Second, and that's why the AFCFTA is important, you cannot divide North and South. So to me, I'm a Pan-Africanist. I never say Sub-Saharan Africa. No, I never use the phrase. I talk about Africa. So it's important that we maintain that right now. The AFCFTA gives it. And the AU role, I can go on and on about the AU, the Africa we want, Africa 20. A lot of it is rhetoric, some of it. One of the things we're doing here now for Africa, and there's that context that answers the other question of NEPAD, is that on infrastructure. Infrastructure development is a huge challenge in Africa. The resources we need. A year we need about $100 billion of investments into infrastructure. Not like that, even connecting the cross-country across Africa. So President Akufo-Addo sometimes threw a challenge to the OECD that you guys are slow with your processes. It takes so long, and that's why China is coming in, and you complain we are going to China. So right now, after that, we got together with the OECD and the AU, and we've done a major study about infrastructure development across Africa. And the Germans have been financing it through the AU to see how do we connect Africa infrastructure. There's the NEPAD called infrastructure PIDA program. It's not new, but there's, so I just wanted to tie that together, tie all those together. So if we think of Africa as one and see what the constraints are from infrastructure, this regional public use, water pools, there's so much we can do together. So I like your question, I think, so that's my answer. And on NEPAD, I think initially there was a criticism that was too much focus on partnership with the North. But I disagree, because later on the focus was on building Africa, and so they were pillars of work and programs for Africa. And we brought in the civil society, but like I said, it was all over the place. There was no sense of prioritization. And this was the 20th year anniversary of NEPAD, and I actually had the honor of moderating a discussion with some leaders 2 weeks ago and some heads of the African institutions to draw lessons from NEPAD. So NEPAD became an African agenda, but it was in the implementation where we fell off, and the same as also the APRO. So that would be on the traditional leaders, and I'm not an expert here. But when it comes to governance issues, I think it's very important, because in Ghana, the traditional rulers are important. When it comes to Galamsey and all these issues, you cannot separate it from there. And on governance issues, the role of the chiefs becomes very important. And I remember when at the EC, we had a major conference on governance. I invited Otumfuo the Ashanti to come and talk to us about the traditional governance structures and what they mean for Africa's democracy and development. But we have not found ways of building that, and I don't have the answer.
You have to apologize to Abdul Malik Gariba, who wanted to ask a question, because we really don't have any time left. We have only a minute or so to go. And so I'll take the opportunity to ask the council's consultant, Beatrice Brew, to say a big thank you to KY on our behalf. Beatrice.
Thank you, Ambassador Say. On behalf of the Council on Foreign Relations, I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you all for joining us today in spite of your busy schedules. To Dr. KY AMOAKO, I'm tempted to just say Shukran, Matolela Mbemba, Asante, Toyanziza. I was tempted to try it, thank you, in Ethiopian, but to avoid making a mistake, I'll simply just say thank you for a very insightful lecture, and also taking us through how far we've come in the democratic process in Africa. Thank you so much, and I hope that Mina will see the Africa that you wish for her. I thank you all once again, then have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, please.